Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCS lower bracket round 2 overview and analysis video. Very excited to get into this one. A couple of really big series, obviously. We've seen some pretty high stakes stuff across the world over the past week, but this LCS recap video here definitely is a high stakes one because the winner of these two series will officially be headed to international play at the very least. Maybe not Worlds, but international play, whereas the losers will officially be eliminated not only from the 2023 Summer Split playoffs, but also from 2023 in general. They will not be able to qualify for Worlds, and so very big series here. 4 teams go in, 2 are going to come out, and 2 are going to be going international. So a lot on the line here, but of course, let me know what you guys thought of these series down in the comment section below. What teams looked good to you? What teams impressed you? What teams did not impress you? And how do you feel about the 4 teams that we're going to know by the end of this video that are going to be representing North America internationally? We might not know the seeds, but we will know the teams, which obviously is a really cool thing. I'd love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions on that down below, but without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Of course, if you're new here, what we do on this channel is we're going to go game by game in each individual series, talking about the strengths and the weaknesses that each team was able to kind of generate for themselves, the advantages and disadvantages, if you will. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything together. We'll lightly preview winners finals as well as this kind of 4th place matchup to see who ends up being in that, European that Western qualifying series, if you will. But I don't want to spend too much time on that. What today's video is for is these 2 series in round 2. So let's go ahead and talk about it. The first one is going to be probably the more interesting of the 2, at the very least on paper. These are 2 teams that I think a lot of people thought were just going to go to Worlds going into playoffs. 2 of the top 4 seeds in North America, and 2 teams that I think are incredibly talented and strong, but one of them will be missing out on international play. It's a matchup between the number 3 seeded Evil Geniuses and the number 4 seeded Team Liquid. It's a really intriguing matchup on paper because I do think that these 2 teams both are kind of feast or famine, if you will. They both have their play styles that they like to go to. The players that when they step up, they typically win, and players that when they don't step up, they typically lose. And that's kind of a funny thing to kind of describe North American teams like that, but that really does feel like the style that a lot of NA teams have ended up going towards over the course of this year. But for Evil Geniuses, obviously, I think a lot of people are correctly going to point to JoJo in the mid lane being the primary focus, being the main focal point of this team, because he absolutely is. When he wins, this team just so comfortably knows how to play in the mid game. JoJo's very active on the map, and they're really good at being able to generate numbers advantages in a lot of different situations if they can start moving their mid and jungle around as a unit. But that obviously is a lot more difficult to do if JoJo doesn't have prio in the early game. So definitely something to keep in mind. I like the other players on this team, but Evil Geniuses has also shown an inability to win if those other players are the only players that are playing well. Not because I think that they are bad carries, but rather I believe that Evil Geniuses just doesn't have a ton of experience playing through those other players, and I think that the team in general just doesn't necessarily play well from behind, and so definitely something to keep in mind there. But for Team Liquid, it's very similar, except I would argue that it's their jungle position that ends up being very important to the team. Pioshik has been incredibly flip-floppy in his time in North America. Not that that should surprise anybody. That's exactly what he was like in Korea as well, but when he's on, he's still really, really good, and he can win a series on his own. If Pioshik shows up, if you get a really good series out of him and APA as a duo, especially APA into JoJo, and that's going to be very Team Liquid favored. But Summit's obviously really, really big for this team. If he can stay rather consistent, that's going to be nice. Yon and Core are very good bot lane, but Unforgiven and Ayla are also incredibly stable. I think that this is actually a pretty even matchup, if I had to say. And that's what I said in my preview at the beginning of last video, or at the end, I should say, of last video, my round 2 winners bracket. When I previewed this series, I talked about how close I thought it was going to be. In that video, I predicted Team Liquid to go over. Not going to change my mind or anything like that. I do think that they are the better team. I think they have more talent, and I think they're more consistent in terms of their play style. But again, I really don't think it's by a ridiculous amount. I would be surprised if the series wasn't at least a little bit close. But I guess we'll find out now if the series is going to be close, because we're going to kick it off with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Team Liquid. They are going to take the first game in this series. They're going to go up 1-0. They're going to take full control, and this was a big win for this team. A lot of the players that we were talking about needing to step up, needing to have really good series or games, I think really did prove that they are here to play in game number 1. Evil Geniuses, to their credit, also had a lot of mistakes and a lot of problems that I think contributed a lot to Team Liquid just kind of running away with this game in the mid to late game, but you do still have to give a lot of credit to the TL players. I don't think that this would have been nearly as easy of a win if it was just Evil Geniuses underperforming. I do think TL did need to step up and capitalize on a lot of those mistakes, but I certainly don't think Evil Geniuses made their life any harder in game number 1. It looks like this team, is kind of a little bit mental boomed at the moment. Obviously, that series against Cloud9 not going great, but they need to snap out of it because this Team Liquid team is dangerous, and we saw that very much in game number 1. Player of the game is super obvious to anybody who was watching. It's going to go to Summit in the top lane on this Jax. An utter domination of this top lane matchup. You can talk about Revenge having a really bad game, and trust me, we will get into that. A lot of, pretty major misplays by Revenge across this entire game. Mentality misplays, not even like mechanical, just like not having his brain on straight going into this series, but Summit punished that harder than I've seen almost any other top laner in North America punish a mistake like that. This was a phenomenal game from Summit. He was able to kind of dominate the laning phase because, like I said, Revenge was kind of struggling to capitalize on Summit's mistakes. There were a lot of things that the Jax was doing wrong, and, Revenge just couldn't capitalize. He was way too safe, and that allowed Summit to get to the part of the game where he could just start to take over, but by the time they hit the late game, Summit was just outplaying everybody. Like, he was just by far the best player on the Rift, and it was really, really impressive to watch. If this is the version of Summit that you're going to get super consistently over a playoff series, like, this is dominant. Nobody's going to be able to stop Team Liquid if MVP Summit is back, and that's kind of what we got here in game number 1. I really want to give a lot of credit to Pioshik in the jungle as well. Really active on the map, was constantly trying to make plays. You kind of have to on Rel. I talk about this champion a lot. If you get behind on Rel, all of a sudden that champion starts to feel a lot less good in terms of what she's able to output because her entire kit is revolving around you full engaging. And if you can't really do that, or if when you full engage you don't really have good follow-up in order to make it worth it, then it's actually a really bad pick, especially in the jungle. And so ganks have to really go well in the early game. You have to snowball the game out of control. Luckily for Liquid, I think Pioshik was much better than Shaden in the early game and definitely had a great strategy, which was camp mid lane. If we just perma-camp mid lane, if we make sure that JoJo is consistently under fire, then he can't move around the map, he can't create these numbers advantages that they like to generate, and all of a sudden it's so much more difficult for Evil Geniuses to play their game plan. So obviously Summit was the main carry, but I do think Pioshik was good. APA in that same facet was also really good. As the Tristana, you do need to establish pressure pretty early on in this laning phase, especially if you don't want the Ahri moving around the map, but for this Trist in particular, you definitely want to generate that early lead so you can capitalize on the part of the game that I think a lot of people consider to be Tristana's best, which is the mid game, and I really do think that that's where Team Liquid started to take over. Obviously, Yan and Core were good as well, but the top side of the map was the focus this game for a reason. It was Summit, it was Pioshik, it was APA, just kind of dominating their opponents and kind of cruising and coasting to a win, especially after the early game. And then for Evil Geniuses, just some major misplays, some major mental mistakes coming in from this team that I don't think is necessarily akin to like what their problems were in the previous series or in the regular season. This was just a very weird game. First of all, JoJo got shut down in the mid lane, which is always going to be a problem, but major credit to JoJo. He was hard focused by the enemy team, by Rel, by Tristana. He was consistently in a position where he had to play from a negative state, and he still was doing really well in laning phase. That's how good JoJo is, right? He can kind of take a negative situation and still even kind of turn it into a positive, but the problem was because he wasn't able to affect a lot of the other lanes, they just kind of ended up losing, and specifically, top lane was a disaster for Evil Geniuses. Revenge was a no-brainer choice for dead of the game here in the first game of the series. Typically, I would say Aatrox is a really good pick in this matchup because you can do a lot in the late game team fighting to separate that Kai'Sa and that Tristana from really being able to impact the game super heavily, but Revenge was just so passive this game. He consistently had Summit below 30, 25% health in lane phase and then just would back off, and I get it, like Counter-Strike is scary, but like you can position aggressively, you can try to go in on that, and it just didn't feel like Revenge wanted to get gold this game. I have no idea what he was doing in the top lane, playing way too safe and allowing the Jax to scale up into the part of the game where he was just stronger, and then eventually he just got completely outplayed. By the time we hit the late game, Revenge was actively just playing poorly, and this is not the game one that you wanted to see. He was really good in their first series in the playoffs, but over the against Cloud9 he wasn't particularly great, and here he's certainly not started well against Team Liquid, so something to keep an eye out for. Shaden is in this game, and he's going to be in for the rest of the series. Just a little bit of a spoiler, but Shaden was okay. I guess he got completely out-jungled, but like at least he tried to team fight this game. It really was, JoJo Pune actually playing well, even though he was given a ridiculous amount of pressure in the early game from the enemy team, and then Unforgiven and Ayla, the bot lanes in general, were just kind of a non-factor of this game. The game was really decided by the top lane. That really was the major difference maker, and the jungle matchup, I think, was definitely in TL's favor as well. But they've taken control of this series 1-0. Are they going to be able to take a dominating 2-0 series lead, or is Evil Geniuses going to be able to tie the series up, get some of that mental back, and at least prove that you can beat this team? Well, we're going to find out now, because the winner of game number 2 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take a commanding 2-0 series lead here, and this is massive for TL just in general. Being able to generate a 2-0 series lead in the playoffs is huge in pretty much any circumstance. Reverse sweeping is hard. Like, it is really hard, and most teams just aren't going to be able to do it, especially if Liquid's going to be playing as well as they have been playing over the course of this series. So Evil Geniuses definitely on the back foot now. If they weren't in game 1, they definitely are going down 0-2 in game 2, having to win 3 games in a row against a Team Liquid team that is just kind of bodying you at the current moment. We'll talk about this game, but this game wasn't particularly close, and game 1 wasn't particularly close. Like, having to win 3 games in a row after that, it's a tough ask for, I think, this Evil Geniuses team, but it's the ask that they're going to have if they don't want their 2023 season to come to an early end, an unexpected end, if you will. But for Liquid, they continue to play incredibly well. They continue to push the tempo of a lot of their games, and they continue to play a lot of the comps that I think have gotten them here in the first place. Player of the game in game 2, familiar story. It's going to go to Summit in the top lane. There is a massive top gap in this series. I don't really want to be a part of the dogpiling that has been going on right now on social media, from this matchup, because I do think that, obviously it was what it was, right? And it is what it is. Summit has destroyed Revenge in the first 2 games. It's not even been remotely close. It's not even been remotely competitive, but I want to give more of a credit to Summit than I do want to take away things from Revenge. We'll get to him in a bit, because obviously he's not playing well, but Summit is playing out of his mind. He's doing so well in this series. This is actually a matchup that has not been entirely Summit favored over his time in the LCS, which you probably would not expect, but Revenge is one of the few top laners that has actually been able to go toe-to-toe with Summit in lane when they play off against each other. That has absolutely not been the case in this series. Summit has destroyed him both games so far and has really been an absolute menace, both early and late into this game. Cassante is obviously a ridiculous champion that has a ridiculous kit, but you still have to pilot him well, and Summit just looked like the best player in the entire league in this game, and if he's going to play like this, it's going to be so much easier for Liquid to just kind of dominate the rest of this series, because top lane is one of those positions where if you really, really get ahead, like, a lot of those champions are very difficult to stop from snowballing out of control. So, good from Summit. Pioshik continues to be really good on the rel. Shaden is not able to keep up with Pioshik. This is very much a mismatch in terms of, these two teams. I think Shaden obviously being thrust into a position he probably wasn't prepared for, and now he's got to go up against a world champion in the playoffs for a world spot, having played 3 regular season games in the LCS. It's certainly not an ideal situation for Shaden, but Pioshik is unfortunately kind of taking advantage of it, if you will. A lot of early aggression coming in from Team Liquid and from Pioshik on this rel in particular. Talked about it last game. You definitely want to have that early aggression. And then the double flex, the quote-unquote double flex here for Team Liquid that they've gone to so much over the course of this year, the Ziggs and the Tristana. More often than not, you'll see them swapped here with the Ziggs in the bot lane and the Tristana in the mid lane, but APA is a big Ziggs player. We know he's a big, artillery mage player, and Yon can, definitely play Tristana. We're going to see that more in this series as well. I call it a quote-unquote double flex because, yes, I do think this could be flipped, but this is the orientation that they do play these two champions in the most, and so I think in draft, you're probably more so expecting something like this, but both of them played it well. Core pulling out the Taric. He's pulled it out a lot over the course of these playoffs. It's certainly something that is becoming a popular pick for him and him alone. If it works, it works. It's worked every single time he's picked it so far, so it's really hard for me to complain about it. I like Taric as a champion. I think he does a lot of good things. It's interesting to see, Core really being the only player in the world to be playing Taric at the moment, but certainly something intriguing. I think Liquid has stumbled onto something, but in general, they're just better, and that's kind of the biggest problem for EG in this series, and unfortunately, I don't really know how you solve that if you're EG. I don't know how you solve just kind of losing in lane, being worse across the map, specifically in the top lane. I know we've already talked about it. Revenge is going to get another dud of the game for me here in game number 2. It was just miserable. He played this matchup so bad, and he was so useless, especially towards the back half of this game. There really is nothing else to say. This has not been a series to remember for Revenge in the top lane. Summit just kind of owned him through the first 2 games. Now, obviously, the series isn't over, and there's going to be some opportunities for Revenge to get his, revenge, pun intended, but I don't know, man. If the first two games are anything to go off of, Summit's just going to brutalize him this entire series, and you're going to have to win elsewhere. JoJo has shown that he's going to be able to generate leads, but game 2 was way worse than game number 1 for him. He was targeted again by Liquid, again by the Rel in particular, and, you know, Evil Geniuses just doesn't really have, like, a countermeasure to that at all, but, you know, I think JoJo in his mechanics were definitely worse this game. Shading keeps getting out-jungled. Unforgiven and Ayla can never hit the part of the game where they're actually going to be able to win late because they're playing Kai'Sa, Rakan, and you're just, like, hoping and praying to scale up because you're playing into Tristana and you're not going to win early, and so Unforgiven's just been kind of useless. Ayla's been kind of useless over the beginning part of this series, and topside has just lost super hard. I really don't know what you do here if you're Evil Geniuses. You have to get JoJo ahead, and you have to hope that Revenge can hold up. Shaden needs at least one good game. Those are the things that all kind of need to happen in order for this EG team, I think, to take a game off of Team Liquid, but I guess it's possible, and they're certainly going to have to do it now, but are they going to be able to take a game, at least show that they deserve to be in this series a little bit, or is Team Liquid just going to steamroll them on their way to a 3-0 sweep? Well, we'll find out now because the winner of game number 3 was Evil Geniuses. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to stay alive in this series, which obviously was the most important thing for them in this third game. They're going to stay alive in 2023, and I do think they did play well. Now, Team Liquid definitely bailed them out a bit by saying, we're just going to pick all the things that we think are good right now that aren't necessarily the most meta picks in the entire world, things that we feel comfortable on as players, a lot of our comfort picks, Pioshik on Poppy, APA on Cassio, Yon on Ezreal, things that I wouldn't necessarily consider all that strong, even though they had blue side, and Evil Geniuses was like, okay, yeah, we'll take Tristana, Kai'Sa, R1, R2, like, yes, please, sign us up for that, and then they had a lot more opportunities in order to play the game, but again, we've seen opportunities for Evil Geniuses over the course of this series. What is holding them back has not been draft, it's been, you know, playing the game, quite frankly. It's been the micro, it's been the macro, it's been the mechanics, it's been everything else. They've just not been able to generate any sort of consistent success throughout this series up until this point because of their play, but I do think that they capitalized on what was a good draft in this game a lot better. So let's go ahead and go over it. My player of the game is going to go to Unforgiven in the bot lane. Been talking about how top side of the map has not necessarily been a positive for Evil Geniuses overall in this series, and I would continue to agree with that opinion. I think Revenge in Game 3 still struggled quite a bit. The Gwen was very far behind the Cassante, and that's never a good thing. Gwen is specifically picked as a counter to Cassante, and so you never want to be sitting in lane down a ton in that matchup, but luckily for Revenge, basically everybody else on the map was super aggressive and super far ahead. Shaden was a lot more active on the Ivern. I like this pick a lot for Evil Geniuses. They played it a lot when Armeo was in the lineup because obviously he's a big Ivern player, but even with Shaden in, I do think that this could be a really good strategy for the team. It allows JoJo a little bit more flexibility in how he wants to play the early laning phase because he can request help basically at any time. And Tristana into Cassio is a much easier matchup to end up winning than something like a Ziggs, right? Like, you're going to have a lot more agency in that lane to play aggressive and to try and push up. And I think JoJo took advantage of that. They actually started playing for him. Shaden in particular actually started playing for him in the mid lane, but really the player that stood out to me was Unforgiven in the bot lane. We've been talking again about how topside's been the problem. Bot lane has not necessarily been the problem for Evil Geniuses. Both bot lanes have kind of been, for lack of a better term, neutral, right? Like, they've just kind of done their thing, and then the game spirals out of control to the point where Team Liquid has just won up until this point in the series. But Unforgiven, I do think, had easily his best game. Him and Ayla, I think, did really solid. The Kai'Sa was doing infinitely more damage than whatever the Ezreal was doing on the other side. That's just a champion that I don't think is all that good unless you're, like, crazy good, as we saw Berserker with, a couple of days ago. But unfortunately, Yon just didn't have a similar performance on that, and so Unforgiven had a lot of opportunities to be able to generate his lead. Again, he got a lot more resources, he got a lot more help from the rest of his team, but Unforgiven's going to be big in this series. We've talked about Yon and Core not necessarily dominating any of the laning phases. If Unforgiven and Ayla can step up, that could be an avenue where Evil Geniuses could start winning games. Obviously, JoJo had a much better game, and I think in general, that just unlocks basically everything that EG wants to do, but, you know, having a more spread out, a more wider variety of ways to win, I think is never going to hurt this Evil Geniuses team. And then for Liquid on the other side, this kind of felt like a test game, if I'm being entirely honest. You pick Poppy on B1, which I'm personally a fan of. I think Poppy is really good, and when you look at things like Tristana and you look at Leona, like, Poppy can be pretty solid into those, but you're not looking at a Rakan, you're not looking at a Rel. These are the things that I think Poppy does much better into, and you ended up banning those out. You didn't want to give those over, which is fine, but outside of that, maybe don't give over both Trist and Kai'Sa if you're not going to answer with a strong carry, because you had Cassio and Ezreal. Ezreal I've already talked about. I think he's relatively weak in comparison to the best ADCs in the meta right now. I do think he's pilotable. Like, I think you can win on Ezreal. I just don't think it's going to be particularly easy for you to do that. I would say Varus is just kind of a better version of Ezreal, and I'm surprised that they didn't go for that in this game, but Yawn is going to get my dud of the game. The Ezreal was doing negative damage down the stretch, and I think that was a big problem for Liquid. And then APA was also not entirely great this game. He was doing a lot better towards the back half. He just pilots Cassio really well. I just don't think this is a very good Cassiopeia game. And I like this champion quite a bit. I do think it's underutilized in the current meta, but it's probably not something that I would have went for in this game, especially when you already have the Poppy. Because really what you're using that for is to attempt to disable a lot of the engage coming out. Either Tristana's escape or the engage from Leona or Kai'Sa or anything like that while also being a major damage dealer. But it feels like kind of the overlap there just doesn't necessarily work in the same way for me. Summit was still really good on the top side. He's been the best player in this series, and that sure was still the case in this game, but it just wasn't enough. Again, if the rest of the map loses, there's not really all that much you can do on K'Sante. So nice win for Evil Geniuses. They absolutely needed it. Obviously, their season would have been done in a sweep if they weren't able to pick up that win, but their backs are very much still up against the wall. They're going to need to win Game 4 as well, but if they do, then momentum will have completely swung in their favor. But for Liquid, you definitely want to close this series out as quickly as possible. Don't allow Evil Geniuses to get any sort of confidence. Don't make this go to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. So is EG going to push it there, or is Liquid going to shut the door after a little bit of a test game in game number 3? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to close out this series with a 3-1 win, and it does look like that game 3 was a little bit more of an outlier than it was something to continuously look at. This was a great game from Liquid. This is basically everything that you could want and everything that you could ask for out of this team, and this series, I think, is a great, that's kind of a summarization of this series in general for Liquid, is everything that you kind of wanted to see out of this team in the playoffs. They kind of performed in this series. I think Summit and Pioshik have always been the more flippy members of Liquid. We talked about Yawn and Core being incredibly stable in the bot lane, and whoever's been in the mid lane, Harry or APA, I think has looked fine enough to be able to win, so long as the main carries on the top side in Summit and Pioshik are playing well. And boy, did they play well in this series. They were both phenomenal. Pioshik is going to get my player of the game for game 4 here on the Viego. Fantastic Viego game. He's been really good at this champion for a really long time, and honestly, it's gone a little bit under the radar. I obviously know that the Kindred is probably the thing that most people associate him with. Obviously, Poppy, Maokai were big runs in the World Run last year for DRX, but the Viego was major in the regular season for that team and for Pioshik in general. So to see him continuously pull it out here into matchups that I do think are rather favorable for Viego, I mean, you're really looking to get a lot of resets on some immobile targets in the back half of the game. That's what Viego likes. Like, if you're able to get that off, then I think Pioshik's actually in a really good spot. And obviously, you know, over the course of this series, I think we learned pretty clearly that he's just better than Shaden in the jungle. It's a pretty massive gap, and he was able to generate a pretty large lead as well. When you have someone like APA as well there to set everything up, a Taric to keep you safe, especially towards the back half of this game, everything becomes so much easier, and Pioshik truly was phenomenal in this game and phenomenal across this whole series. He was one of the best players in this series and probably would have gotten player of the series had it not been for my player of the series, Summit, in the top lane. I mean, this is a no-brainer. How do you even come up with anything other than Summit in this circumstance? Yes, I guess this K'Sante game wasn't quite as flashy as the first two. He was still incredibly relevant, dominated lane phase like he did basically in all 4 games, if we're being entirely honest, and just had a massive impact. But when you look at games 1 and 2, they were almost single-handedly won by Summit in the top lane. There just wasn't another option for this series. Obviously, Pioshik played really well, and I think in a lot of different series, he would at the very least be in consideration, but with how good Summit was, it just is a no-brainer to end up making him that player of the series. But he truly was fantastic. If he's going to play like this the rest of the playoffs, who's to say they can't win the LCS? And I truly do mean that. Like, Team Liquid at their best look like they can beat anybody. Now, they're not going to play at their best in every single game. That's Team Liquid, you know what I mean? It's just kind of what this team has done. Summit and Pioshik in particular are very hit or miss, but to say they can't make finals, I mean, come on. Like, they could go hot. They could get on a run and end up making finals. It's certainly not out of the realm of possibility for that to be potentially a route and an option for them, and Summit and Pioshik, I do think, are a big turning point for that. If they play like they did in this series, it's going to be a lot easier for them, but I do think everybody else played well. Core was still really good. Love the Taric pick. Love to see them continue to bring it out. I think, you know, any sort of invulnerability, any sort of immunity, if you're a good player and you know how to time it right, can be pretty massive, especially in a very aggressive team comp like this is with the Viego, the Nico, the Tristana, a lot of champions that do want to play rather aggro, you know, on the edge of danger, if you will. If you can give them a couple of seconds of just complete invulnerability, all of a sudden these fights become a lot easier to win because you can deal a lot of damage incredibly quickly. If you give give some invulnerability to Nico, and then she gets an ult off, all of a sudden Viego and Trist can get some resets going, and the fight's basically over at that point. So, do like the Taric pick, and I think Core obviously pilots it really well. He's been playing well. Yon struggled on the Ezreal, but even then, like, his mechanics shine through when he blocked that, I'm trying to remember what it was. I think it was the Ivern root coming in on Core that would have killed him. Really good stuff. Just really heads up play. Immediately cleanses it and gets out on the Ezreal. Just really, really good stuff. He's a really good player, and even if his champion's not dealing damage, I trust him a lot as an AD carry. And then APA was probably the player we talked about the least, but still did a lot in terms of the macro for this team, being able to establish pressure in the mid lane, and obviously making sure JoJo doesn't get out of control was a major deal. So Liquid just playing well, and Evil Geniuses, unfortunately, that's the end of their 2023 season. They will not be going to Worlds. Their playoff run is over, and unfortunately, the narrative did end up being true. They just were a little bit too predictable. When you shut down JoJo Pyun, when you won the jungle matchup, all of a sudden this team kind of crumbled and they couldn't really keep up. Now, it wasn't quite as cut and dry as that. I do think JoJo still played relatively well in this series, you know, in comparison to like what a normal mid I think would do in this circumstance. I don't necessarily think he played great, but he was given a ridiculous amount of pressure by the enemy team, and he wasn't the worst, you know, performer on his team, which I think is admirable, but unfortunately the top side of the map was not good for Evil Geniuses. Revenge is going to get dud of the game again here for game 3. He just got beat in all 4 games in top lane, and that's just not very good. I'm not going to harp on it. Many people on the internet have already done that, and I don't want to, you know, dog pile onto it, but Shaden wasn't very good either, was certainly showing his inexperience in this series against Pioshik, who just kind of bodied him in every game, basically with the exception of game 3, and even then, I don't think Shaden was particularly phenomenal on the Ivern. I think he just kind of allowed JoJo Pyun to be really good in that game, but outside of that, Pioshik was by far the better jungler, and Shaden really struggled. Those are the 2 players that I think were the most noticeable, but JoJo, Unforgiven, Ayla, I think they were fine. It's going to be interesting to see the direction that Evil Geniuses move in. I think they learned a lot this split. It's going to be interesting to see if they want to stick with some of these young players like Ayla and Shaden, or if they want to go all in on potentially, you know, going for another big budget roster like they have done in the past. I imagine JoJo is going to be this team's franchise player. I don't expect him to be going anywhere, but every other position is certainly going to be an intriguing conversation as we enter 2024, but, you know, for now, unfortunately, that's going to be the end of Evil Geniuses' road, and Team Liquid has officially qualified for an international best of 5. Now, it's not Worlds, because there is that Worlds qualification series between NA and Europe with the number 4 seed from each region, but it is an international best of 5 at the very least, and, you know, Liquid, in the form that they're in, like, they very well could go even further than number 4 in terms of the LCS playoffs, I'll just say that. And then moving on to our second series of the lower bracket, round number 2. This one was probably a little bit more of a mismatch on paper than Team Liquid versus Evil Geniuses, but maybe it will be closer considering how the first series ended up going. Of course, this is a matchup between the number 2 seeded Golden Guardians and the number 7 seeded Dignitas. I think a lot of people are surprised to see Dig here in the first place. I know I am. I certainly did not expect them to get over TSM, who I thought was just objectively the better team, but TSM didn't exactly play all that well in that series, as I've covered before. Dignitas really stepping up, Jensen in particular really stepping up, wanting to keep that world streak alive, and he is now officially 1 series away from at the very least getting a chance to play for that, but unfortunately he's running into one of the best teams in North America in Golden Guardians, who has struggled a little bit more as of late. They didn't win their first playoff series against Energy, and I think that was definitely a little bit of a surprise, but I, you know, had a bone to pick with some of their drafts in that series, and I do think that was a little bit of a problem for them. I think their early aggression has gotten worse. I think they're significantly more passive, or at least they were against Energy than they were in the regular season, so it's going to be interesting to see if they fix that. Dignitas, obviously known as a team who's maybe the slowest of any team in any major region, right? They just do not have early aggression. It was something that they did do better at in the series against TSM, but I'm still going to take the entire regular season more than I'm going to take, you know, that one series against TSM, but it was better in that series. It is worth noting that, but golly, they are a slow team when they want to be, and I think talent-wise, you know, you could argue that Golden Guardians has an advantage there as well. I think a lot of people would say that GG should be able to demolish this series, and I think I would probably be one of them. I'm certainly not a Dignitas believer, but Jensen's got some sort of voodoo magic to get to Worlds every single year, and who am I to keep him from using it? It'll be interesting to see, but this is going to be a fun series nonetheless. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it, of course, starting with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Golden Guardians, they are going to take the first game of this series, go up 1-0, and this is what they should be doing. They should be going up 1-0. They should be winning through their macro. Now, there are some concerns with this game. I certainly don't want to sit here and say that this was easily, like, it dissuaded all my doubts. There is no worries, you know. I'm certainly not going to say any of those things about this game because there were quite a few things that still did concern me about Golden Guardians, most notably the pace of this game, which was, again, very slow, which I do actually think favors Dignitas in this series. However, Golden Guardians is just better. A lot of mechanical misplays coming in from Dignitas that really did cost them the game. I think a lot of underperformances, even if a couple of players did step up and play relatively well. But Golden Guardians was just the better team overall. And so even if they're playing a style that I wouldn't necessarily consider good for them or in their favor across these two teams, I do think that they have enough talent to be able to overcome that. Player of the game for me is going to go to Huhi in the support position. Really happy to be able to say that, especially on something like Rel, because honestly, he was really bad in the Energy series. I think he was clearly the worst player on Golden Guardians in that series, and that's really not what you want to see from a player that I had as like an MVP finalist, right? Like he was the driving force of this Golden Guardians team in the regular season, in my opinion, and I just don't think that that backed up in their first series of the playoffs. Now, obviously, I trust Huhi to be able to figure it out. He's a playoff performer, or at least he has been over the course of his career, and I would expect him to continue to be that here on Golden Guardians, and I think this is a step in the right direction. Seeing him play really aggro, especially towards the back half of the game on the Rel, being able to consistently get on, you know, Tomo, who, you know, had tools to get out but didn't necessarily use them, or Jensen, who's incredibly immobile if you do get a good position on him. There were just ways, I think, to deal with Dignitas this game, and I do think that Golden Guardians piloted it well. Huhi, in particular, I think played well. River's another player that I really want to point out. Typically speaking, I'm actually a lot lower on the Nocturne pick when it comes to pro play. I think Nocturne's just kind of meh. Like, I most of the time, I think it doesn't have enough damage to really make it worth it. You're oftentimes trading 1-for-1 on the backline, which can sometimes be good, but sometimes it just doesn't matter, right? Like, you need good follow-up in order to make Nocturne really all that relevant as a pick. However, when you're playing into Xerath, yeah, I like the Nocturne a lot more in that instance, because it's one of the only reliable ways that you're going to be able to get and stick onto that Xerath on the backline, which I do like in the back half, and I do think River played this well. Santorin was okay. I don't think either jungler was willing to take any sort of major risks in the early game, but both were okay. I think 6A was good this game, certainly the better AD carry. Gory definitely had his problems, especially in the early laning phase going into Jensen, was probably the biggest weakness on this team, at least in game number 1, but I still think the Azir was more than enough to be like a big damage dealer, and they were really relying on him in the back half. I think he did his job there, and Licorice was fine. Really, this was Huhi's good engages, River being able to get onto the Fed Xerath, and 6A cleaning everything else up, which is a good strategy. However, I would like to see a more complete early game come in from this team, because I think if they can get that down, this series is not going to be relatively close. And then for Dignitas on the other side, there were some positives to take away from this game. I do think that Jensen played really well on the Xerath. I've seen people criticizing the Leandri's build, but I kind of like it in this game because it gives you consistent damage, whereas like I think Luden's is going to be a little bit more, you know, burst damage. I think that, you know, Jensen's going to be a little bit more consistent across this game with that build, and I'm not a Xerath main or anything like that, so correct me if I'm wrong down in the comment section, but I've just seen a lot of people complaining about it, and I don't necessarily see the problem. He was doing more than enough damage throughout this game, and truthfully, when you look at this comp, like, I do think you actually need the Xerath quite a bit in the team fight stage to, like, be consistent, and so I like the build, and I think Jensen did a relatively good job on this, unfortunately. Kind of got shut down towards the back half of the game. Really not much you can do into this comp. You need to rely on the rest of your teammates to be able to step up, and unfortunately, that just didn't happen in this game. A couple of players, 2 players in particular, playing pretty bad. My dud of the game is going to go to Tomo on the Xayah. This was a really bad game from Tomo. He's kind of just been AD carry, I guess I should say, over the course of this split. Certainly not someone that is like completely stood out, but someone that I don't think has caused like major problems for his team either. Not someone that I'm really looking at as like a major piece for an LCS team moving forward, but I do think you could do worse than him. This was just like an uncharacteristically bad game. Typically speaking, he's too aggressive. In this game, he was way too passive, not even willing to try and team fight, and when he did try, he was dying basically instantly. And then the other player was Rich in the top lane on this Cassante. This champion can look super broken at times, but if you don't pilot it well, it's not going to look very good. And I like Rich a lot. I thought he was the best player on this team in the regular season, so to see him be so bad is certainly frustrating. I thought Santorin and Poom were fine. Certainly no major issues. I actually like some of the engages coming out from Poom on the Alistar, and he's had a good run in the playoffs so far, but it really was Jensen as the main damage dealer, and then you're just hoping and praying that that's enough to be able to win fights, and unfortunately, for Dig, it just was not. So, Golden Guardians taking game number 1. They're taking control of this series, but is Dignitas going to be able to tie it up at 1 apiece, or is Golden Guardians going to take a dominant lead just like we saw Team Liquid do earlier on in the round? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Golden Guardians, they are going to take the second game of this series as well. That's a 2-0 start for them across these first two games, and that puts them in a super commanding position. If game one was a little bit more kind of slow paced, a little bit back and forth, but Golden Guardians kind of owning the map and just overall playing a little bit better down the stretch, this was definitely more of a punch in the mouth from Golden Guardians. This was a much more dominant performance, and this is kind of what I wanted to see from them in this series. As much as I do like the story of Dignitas, and as much as I do think that this team is, probably better than what their regular season was, right? Especially in terms of talent. Like, we all thought they were going to be a top 6 team going into the year. Obviously, things didn't end up panning out, but, they're okay. Like, they're certainly not a disastrous team. Golden Guardians absolutely should destroy them, right? Even with all that being said, Golden Guardians should absolutely destroy them. This is more of the performance I was expecting out of this series, and it even came on a couple of picks that this is a very risky comp to end up playing here in Game 2. I do kind of like it, but, we'll talk about it in a second. Player of the game for me is going to go to Stixay in the bot lane on this Ezreal. Was just talking in the previous series about how Ezreal is just not a particularly good pick right now, and I do stand by that, but Stixay is one of those players that has played so much Ezreal that, like, yeah, sure, you know what, whatever. Like, you're so good at this champion. I can see you picking him up right now and still doing well on him. And man, when you get Ezreal going, then it's a completely different story, right? Expecting Ezreal to be able to play from neutral, as well as a lot of these other AD carries, is a lot of faith in a pick that I just don't think is as good at that as a lot of other meta AD carries at the current moment. Tristana and Zeri on the other side of this map are great examples, right? They're just going to be more useful from neutral than Ezreal is. However, Ezreal still has the possibility of just being able to win early laning phase hard enough to the point where they're just so strong. And that poke really is doing a ridiculous amount of damage over the course of an entire game. And that's what we got here. Especially adding that on top of something like a Jace as well. All of a sudden, it's so much more difficult to actually ever check anybody once we get into the mid game here. And Golden Guardians knew that. And so they knew they could just force every single play every single time. Because who's stepping up? Who's eating Ezreal Q or Ezreal WQ alongside Jace Shock Blast? Like, who's doing that? I'm not doing that. Like, Sejuani's not doing that. Kasante's not doing that. Nautilus isn't doing that. So who's walking up and taking that? No one can on the side of Dignitas, and that became a pretty big problem. You add on to that the fact that not only do they have reliable forms of engage and zone control with Maokai Ultimate, with Leona just in general, but they've got a good flanker in the Renekton as well. This is a very well-rounded comp. However, you do need to get ahead for this to work. Obviously, if you're playing from behind the Jace and the Ezreal, don't do nearly enough damage to be able to justify trying to teamfight with them. But if you're at a stage of the game where you're an item up on basically everybody, all of a sudden you get 27 kills in 23 minutes. And so that's kind of what we got this game. Stixay had to play fantastic, and I think he did. He continued to be really good. Leona's been a pretty big signature pick for him for quite a while. These more aggressive, engaged supports are obviously what he is going to be most well known for as a player, but specifically Leona, I think the overly aggressive nature of Leona has always been good for he. It just gives him this full engage kind of combo that he wants to pull off, and nobody really does that better than him. Gory was really good on the Jace. River controlled the entire map on the Maokai. Licorice was solid on the Renekton. Everybody stepped up in this game. You don't get 27 kills in 23 minutes and absolutely destroy the enemy team if all 5 members aren't playing up to snuff. This was just a really good game from Golden Guardians. And then for Dignitas on the other side, this was the opposite. You got blasted and now you're down 0-2. This is not the circumstance that I think you wanted to find yourself in. You are one game away from having your season end, and obviously you're excited to be here, I think, in the first place in the top 6. But I think you probably wanted to put up at least a little bit of a better fight than what you did here in Game 2. Dead of the game could basically go to anybody. Nobody played well in this game. I toyed around with it being Rich in the top lane. I toyed around with it being Jensen in the mid lane, but I'm going to give it to Poom in the support position. The Nautilus was crazy useless this game. Nautilus has to survive. Like, he has to be able to not die instantly, or else that champion just does literally nothing. And unfortunately, Poom was dying so fast in every single engage, and it was really difficult for him to have any sort of impact on the game. Once the Ezreal started getting going in the mid-game, then all of a sudden Poom became entirely useless. I'm not going to blame it entirely on him as a player. I do think he played really bad at the beginning of this game, but once you hit the point where the enemy team is so strong, there's only so much you can do on Not. Like I said, Jensen and Rich, the solo laners, I think also played really bad this game. A lot of misplays coming in from them, specifically Rich, who I just don't think has had a good series up until this point. Jensen had probably his worst game of the playoffs, including the TSM series in this one. Not a good Tristana game, and that's a champion we've criticized him for in the past. Tomo and Santorin certainly weren't adding anything to this team. Basically, everybody got run over. Like, there's nobody that I can give any sort of major excuse to. This was just not a good game from Dignitas, and if they have one more of these, they're gonna be out. It is as simple as that, but obviously, we've seen this Dig team have some fight in them. We saw them be relatively even in Game 1, even if they weren't entirely competitive down the stretch of that. You're just gonna need to see the best game of the series out of them here in game number 3, or else it's gonna be the end of their 2023 season. But for Golden Guardians, you know, you probably didn't want to be down here in lower bracket in the first place. Hopefully you can make it a quick return up into the top 4. Of course, 1 game away now from being able to qualify for an international best of 5. You know, saying that at the beginning of the year would have been massive going into the World Championships. And so this is a big series and a big game for both of these teams. But who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Golden Guardians. They are going to take the 3rd game in this series. It's going to be brooms out for them because it is a clean sweep over Dignitas, and they are going to confirm a best of 5 international series as well. Now, obviously, that means one of the 2 teams that, you know, won today is going to be facing one of the European seeds, the number 4 seed from Europe, you know, to try and get into play-ins at Worlds, which is obviously going to be an absolute blast. But at the very least, one of the teams that qualified today will be getting into the main stage of Worlds by themselves, and Golden Guardians really has a good shot of being that team, especially with how they played in this series. This was just a complete team effort from them, and they looked really, really good doing it. This was the number 2 seed that we were all expecting coming into playoffs, not what we got against NRG. This was a much, much better performance from this team, so let's talk about it. Let's start with game 3 just in particular, and then I'll kind of open it up a little bit wider through the 3 games, but player of the game in game 3 pretty obviously is going to go to Licorice in the top lane. Great game from him. He had honestly been the most quiet member, I would say, over the first 2 games. A lot of attention going into the bot lane. Stixxay and Huhi were definitely driving forces for the first 2 games, but Licorice took control, took the reins, took the spotlight here in game number 3, and I think you're excited about that. Licorice has been phenomenal for this team, has easily been the most consistent player on Golden Guardians over the course of this year, and especially this split, which is wild to say considering, you know, like 2 or 3 weeks into summer split, or spring split, I should say, this year, I was like, is he the worst top laner in the LCS? And now I'm like, he's the best top laner in the LCS. It's pretty wild, the transformation that he has gone on, getting his confidence back, getting back into a good state of mind. It's really been fantastic for him, and the results, you know, speak for themselves with how good he's done. Awesome Cassante game. We'll talk about Rich in a second, but Rich was absolutely trolling in this game, and Licorice took advantage of it, consistently killing Rich under tower. Not under his tower, I guess under Licorice's tower, I should say. Rich continuously trying to, I don't know, just die. I can't even begin to tell you what was going on, but Licorice took advantage of that, consistently knocking him back under tower and just killing him straight up, and so good for Licorice. I do think he played it relatively well, but was given quite a lot of tools and turned a lot of those advantages into a pretty game-breaking lead, and so good stuff from him. River was really good this entire series. Gory was pretty solid after game number 1 in particular, but player of the series for me is actually going to go to Stixxay in the bot lane. I think there's a real case to be made that this could be Huhi as well. I think it's one of those 2 that is my player of the series, but I'm going to give it to Stixxay. I thought he was the most consistent member across all 3 games. The Aphelios in game 1 was obviously great, but the Ezreal games in 2 and 3 were really, really solid on a champion that isn't nearly the same kind of power level that we're seeing from something like Kai'Sa on the other side of the map. And so, honestly, really impressed with what Stixxay has been able to do. He's been crazy good for this team, obviously, over the course of this year. One of the best AD carries in the West, full stop, in terms of how he's playing at the current moment. And I think this series was a good example of that. He was probably the player that stood out the most to me. But again, if you wanted to give this to Huhi, I'm certainly not going to complain all that much. He was really good in game 1 on the Rel, even better, arguably, in game 2 on the Leona, and then, you know, was a little bit more shaky on the Nautilus, I'll say, in game number 3 here. Was still obviously really good, but I think Stixxay was a little bit better, which is why I'm going to go ahead and give him player of the series rather than Huhi. But again, this was more of a team effort. It wasn't like the previous series where Summit was just kind of the best player on the Rift, and it was very clear who player of the series was. This was a much more open-ended discussion because Golden Guardians as a team was just better than Dignitas, and I think that was pretty clear here. So they're moving on, but Dignitas' 2023 is over, and man, it's been a tumultuous 2023. That I think we can all agree on. This has not been the year that I think this organization ended up anticipating, but it's crazy because they kind of got the result that I think that they were anticipating, which was top 6 in the summer split. I do think that was kind of their goal. Obviously, in a perfect world, I think they would have liked to go to Worlds, or at least have a chance to go to, you know, have a chance to play their way into Worlds. But I do think that realistically, like, top 6 at the beginning of the year would have been a positive for Dig, and that's where they ended up. It might have been a super windy road to get there, but we got there nonetheless. This game number 3 was not particularly good, though. Dud of the game is no-brainer Rich. Like, I can't even begin to tell you what he was doing in this game. This was one of the biggest, like, troll jobs I have ever seen. I can't even begin to explain, you know, the thought process behind it. Usually in segments like this, I'm just like, Rich, you know, he was probably thinking this and this and this, and that's why he did this, and, you know, it's okay. You know, everybody has bad games, but, like, this just felt like I'm full tilted. I'm just gonna run it. Like, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you here. There's not a lot of analysis I can give because I don't imagine this kind of game is going to be repeatable, but he was really good over the regular season, so to see him just, like, completely troll this final game of the year for them, it's kind of a funny end, but it certainly is something. Jensen was just much worse in this series than he was in the previous one against TSM. He was their driving force in that series to get here to the top 6, and I just don't think he had the same kind of, fervor in this series that he did before, and so for Jensen, obviously, his world streak comes to an end. That's definitely disappointing for him, but I don't think a lot of people were expecting them to be able to overcome the hump. It would have been a pretty big miracle run if this team ended up getting top 4 after how they had finished. Tomo easily had his best game of the series, but Poom really struggled in this one. He was much worse, I would say, in this series as well. Santorin was just kind of irrelevant, as he has kind of been at his best all year long, and so for Dig, I'm not really surprised to see this be the outcome. This is really kind of what I expected from this team, especially in a series like this, but I do think that they did their best to get here, right? A couple of changes, a couple of overperformances, especially from the solo laners. I do think that going from, easy 10th, easy worst team in the entire league, all the way up to top 6 in Summer Split is a pretty good adjustment from this team. And while I don't really know what direction this org's going to go in, because I don't even know if the org is going to be in the LCS next year, what I do know is that a couple of these players are probably going to be in high demand, especially for bounce-back seasons, and it's going to be interesting to see how everything ends up shaking out. But for Golden Guardians, like I said, they've now made top 4, which is massive for this team. We'll talk about their series in just a second, but congratulations on them, not completely fumbling the bag and being able to win this series to get into that upper bracket slot. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCS Losers Bracket Round Number 2 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, Golden Guardians, Dignitas, Evil Geniuses, Team Liquid, both very, very fun series, but Golden Guardians and Team Liquid are going to be moving on into that next round of the lower bracket, Round 3, if you will. Of course, the winner of that will secure their spot in the main stage, the Swiss stage of the World Championships this year, which is very exciting, joining, of course, Energy and Cloud9 on the top side of the bracket. But let's quickly go ahead and preview these two series that we're going to be covering in the next video, starting, of course, with Energy versus Cloud9, because that one will be first. A very intriguing matchup. Energy, I think, has overperformed my expectations up until this point, but maybe I'm just a hater. I do not see them being able to take down Cloud9. That feels like a series that should very much be in favor of C9. At the moment, it just feels like they're more mechanically talented than everybody else that they're going up against. Blabber and Berserker in particular just feel like absolute menaces on the Rift, and it's not like Eminus, Sven, and Fudge are, weak links at any point. I really do think that Cloud9's got kind of the favor, they're the favor basically in every single role, and I would expect them to be able to take it. Energy, I think, is a major underdog coming into that series, and then in round number 3, you've got Golden Guardians, you've got Team Liquid. This is definitely a more interesting matchup. Of course, like I said before, the winner moving on to the main stage, the loser will have to play a best of 5 against Europe's number 4 seed in order to make the play-in stage at Worlds, and who do I think is going to be the one in that play-in stage? Well, who's most notorious for getting 4th? Of course, I'm going to pick Golden Guardians in this series, because Team Liquid simply has to get 4th. Jokes aside, I think Golden Guardians is too consistent. I think they've looked really good when they want to over the course of this split, and this is a massive series for them. I expect 6A and Huhi to be massive. Yon and Core could absolutely make a difference in a series like this, but like Gory into APA, that's a matchup I would definitely favor Golden Guardians in. Someone like River into Pioshik, I can see that being Pioshik favored if he's playing perfect, but River's certainly been more consistent, and Licorice is one of the few top laners that I think can go toe-to-toe with Summit in a series like this. So I'll have Golden Guardians, but again, I do think Team Liquid holds a shot in this series. If Summit and Pioshik step up, and especially if like Yon or APA like really pop off, like I could absolutely see Team Liquid winning this. I think it's just going to be a little bit more it's unexpected if they do than if Golden Guardians wins. I think they are favorites, but not nearly as like massive of favorites as I think Winners Finals is. But let me know what you guys' thoughts are down in the comment section below. Who do you think is going to be winning those two series? What did you think of the two series today? Would love to know you guys' thoughts. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot for me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. Of course, if you're new here, hit subscribe. Worlds is right around the corner, and we're covering every region that's, majorly qualifying for Worlds, at least the main stage. And so if you want full analysis of, every Western, every Eastern major region, this is the place for it. You want to get that scoop on what Worlds teams might surprise, this is definitely the place for it. So hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.